All right, so for this week with the whiteboard sessions, I wanted to go over some more in-depth information for picking the exercises for certain days and some of the reasons why, and talk about the multiple layers for being able to pick that. So just as a quick recap as we're going through, the first week we talked about the ability to put a score on the different energy systems, and then we talked about weekly fluctuations, and then the inverse correlation between volume and intensity for the most part, and then the different energy systems that are involved in those different fluctuations. We looked at a practical application for the scores within the weekly fluctuation, and then the level of recoverability and the deficit that an individual, whether they're an athlete or just a general member or a general gym goer, would have at the end of the week. Some of the practical strategies that you can use, whether those are from a practitioner or self-care or mechanical devices that in order to enhance recovery, and what the new score for your recovery would be at the end of the week or the end of a training block. And then finally, looking at how we put some of this information into a full system, a little bit more in depth. So one of the things we talked about before is that, well, let me back up for 1 second. The fluctuation, a lot of times when I talk about this, again, I'll refer to this area right here as Wednesday, and this area over here, like day one, is Sunday or Monday. That's because a majority of the information that comes out about this is using societally influenced fluctuations. And what that means is that for the most part, the only time that we get an opportunity to really shift out into parasympathetic and relax and recover is like Friday, Saturday, Sunday, which is why you start to see this dip happen right over here, and then the cortisol sensitivity peak happen around like Tuesday, Wednesday. So anyway, it doesn't have to be this. I've worked with a handful of people where this is not their fluctuation. This actually isn't mine at all, but that isn't unique in any way. Everyone has their own. It's just that this is what is seen quite a bit, and so that's what I've learned, and that's how I talk about it. So this day one, we'll say, is really good for the cardiovascular system and for drills. Why? Because it's really low intensity drills. One of my favorite ways of talking about this is an interview where they said, what are your scales? And what they're referring to is musical training. And if you were to play an instrument, you have to practice fundamentals. No matter how good you are, you always practice fundamentals. And with an instrument, it's a lot of times practicing scales. So having that idea for any activity, what are your scales? That's what day one and day 5 are really, really good for. 5, 6. Then we look at, say, Tuesday right here, where Tuesday, Thursday are really good for strength. And I don't mean strength like resistance training per se, but things that require like 70 to 85% intensity, you're going to have a little bit better recovery acutely, so for like between sets or between exercises. But you're not going to be moving super fast. You're not going to be doing your absolute most explosive training. And then that happens on this Wednesday portion right here, or your peak for the week, where you have a lot of neurological ability for like the 85 to 100%, where you're looking at very explosive training, or a lot of technical training or skill acquisition is a very good day for that one. Now you look at that and you go, well, that's fantastic, but all I do is I go do cardio for 6 days a week. More than likely, you're not pushing this 85 to 100%. You might be doing like a little bit more of a speed day. You go out there and you do like a tempo day or something like that, where you're looking at like these Tuesday, Thursday intensities, but not this high one right here. Okay, so you're not pushing that. That's good. That's fine. You don't have to worry about this. On the flip side of that spectrum, you have certain styles of working out where you go and do a workout of the day and you destroy yourself for 5 to 6 days a week, adding in this wonderful combination of incredibly high intensity for high volume and high sets. And now you're riding like this really high intensity the whole time until you eventually crash. And what people don't understand, and this is what I'm hoping some of this information from a visual perspective, not just the quantification of it, but a visual perspective will start to paint a better picture, no pun intended, is that it takes quite a while for that negative adaptation to really go through the entire hierarchy of how much it affects you. And then it takes quite a bit of time before you can come out of that. And what happens is it takes so much time that we have this really short attention span on how terrible we feel, that eventually we just think, oh, this is normal, this is how we've always felt, this is how we'll always feel, but I'm being healthy and I'm doing things that are good for me and I'm doing things that I really like to do, so it's okay to feel this bad. No, you don't have to. Now there's an argument that has been going on for quite a while where people say like you don't have to be sore in order to train effectively, and other people that say like you aren't training effectively unless you're sore. And unfortunately, I think in a lot of ways that conversation, it's not only this but definitely a part of it, is only looking at a minute level of the recovery, and that level is referring to simply muscle soreness. And that's it. And they're looking at it on a 24 to 48 hour basis, and unfortunately a lot of the recovery information is also looking at that, on how quickly can recover from soreness, how quickly can we get back a range of motion. And if you remember back here, we're looking at multiple levels of recoverability on different systems, getting a combined score for all three of those, putting them together. And that's what we're trying to recover with using these advanced practices over here. And when we look at this, it's not practical to think that an athlete would be able to fall in these different sections and still get all of their training in. Some people will be able to, absolutely, but a majority won't. We have a number of athletes here who are on a 5-day program. They come in and they lift heavy squats on Saturday because that's just what they do, or some of the powerlifters come in and they lift heavy squats on Sunday. And from what I said before, that's certainly not cardiovascular or drills. So what do? Well, that's layer 2. You have to be able to understand that this is an ideal, and anything outside of that is going to have consequences. And I don't use that word in the dire sense. It's just there is a price to pay for going outside of physiology. Unfortunately, once you quantify it and look at it in a system, you can say, well, what is that price? And if I know the price, what can I do in order to prep myself either ahead of time by putting myself in a recovery surplus with certain practices, or afterward, if I'm doing it in a way that puts me in a deficit or too great of a deficit, what can I do to reduce that deficit? What are the practices? And that is largely what this is all about, is you have to understand the scoring, the fluctuations, where those scores come from, what the inherent deficit and the inherent recoverability is, and the increase that you can have so that you can either reduce the deficit or increase the surplus. So that when you finally get over here and look at the ideal, and life and training rarely allows us to perform the ideal, what are you going to do in order to balance out the scales? That's what this is about. So we come in, we have a consult, we sit down, and I take a look at what your training is, what you're able to do, what you have time for, what you have been doing, and we just start making it like a puzzle, putting pieces together, and suddenly you figure out, well, if you just put in a couple of things right over here, and that helps to balance out some of the weekly fluctuation because you're doing things on days that are less than ideal, suddenly it's no longer a conversation about, well, you're going to be sore or less sore tomorrow or the day after. It's, are you going to feel terrible for the next 4 weeks as you're going through? Are you going to have mornings where you wake up and you can barely get out of bed because your back has been accumulating soreness and fatigue for the last couple of months because you haven't done anything for it? Are you going to have hips that are so tight that you can't really sit in a chair anymore? Like, these are soft tissue aspects, but these are very easy to take care of.